The most dangerous tears are the ones a woman sheds when she believes no one in the world is watching. Clara Bennett had learned to cry without sound. In Blackthorn Hall, even sorrow was expected to know its place. A servant girl might break her back polishing silver, kneel for hours beside cold hearthstones, carry linen up 3 flights of narrow stairs until her fingers burned, but she was never to let grief become visible. Grief belonged to portraits, widows, and noble families with names carved into marble. It did not belong to a gardener's daughter with cracked hands and only 2 dresses to her name. Yet that evening, beneath a sky the color of wet ash, Clara forgot the rules. She slipped through the servants' passage after Lady Vanessa Caldwell accused her of damaging a pearl-handled brooch, though Clara had not touched it. She crossed the rear lawn with her head lowered, past the stone urns, past the shuttered conservatory, past the iron gate no servant was supposed to open. The forbidden garden waited beyond it, silent and overgrown, its roses blackened by frost, its fountain dry, its statues veiled in moss like mourners who had stood too long in the rain. Clara should have turned back. Everyone at Blackthorn knew the garden had been locked for 12 years by order of Duke Alexander Whitmore himself. No one entered. No one spoke of it. No one asked why the master of the house could pass battle paintings, family crypts, and empty dining rooms without flinching, yet would not look toward that garden after sunset. But Clara had nowhere else to put her pain. She pushed through the rusted gate and knelt beside the dead fountain, clutching the small tin box hidden beneath her apron. Inside lay the only things her father had left her: a folded scrap of linen, a dried white rose, and an old iron key stained with age. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking against the cold air, "I tried to keep your promise." The wind moved through the yew trees. A single tear fell onto the tin lid, then another. Clara pressed both hands over her mouth, as if even the garden might punish her for being weak. She did not see the tall figure standing behind the hedge, half concealed by shadow. Duke Alexander Whitmore had come outside for the first time in months only because the accusations in the great hall had stirred an unease he could not name. He had meant only to walk the terrace, to breathe air that did not smell of candle smoke and old regrets. Then he had seen the servant girl pass through the forbidden gate with the caution of someone entering a church after losing faith. Now he stood motionless beneath the dark branches, his gloved hand resting on the stone wall, his face unreadable. He had heard her name. He had heard the tremor in her prayer. But it was the name she spoke next that turned his blood cold. Samuel Bennett did not lie. Clara whispered to the empty garden. "And neither will I." Alexander's hand tightened against the stone. Samuel Bennett, the dead gardener, the man his family had blamed for the night Blackthorn lost everything. Alexander did not move until Clara closed the tin box with trembling fingers and rose from the fountain's edge. She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand, straightened her plain gray dress, and forced her face back into the quiet mask every servant at Blackthorn Hall was expected to wear. By the time she slipped through the rusted gate and disappeared toward the servants' entrance, only the wet marks on the stone proved that she had ever been there at all. The Duke remained behind the yew hedge, staring at the dead fountain as though it had spoken aloud. Samuel Bennett. For 12 years, that name had lived in Blackthorn Hall like dust under a locked door. It was never mentioned at dinner, never written in household records except in the cold language of dismissal, never defended by anyone with enough rank to be heard. Alexander had been 18 when the fire ruined the West Garden wing and took his younger brother Thomas from the life they had both imagined. The official account had been simple, neat, and convenient. Samuel Bennett, the head gardener, had opened the outer gate after midnight. Strangers had crossed the grounds. A lamp had fallen. By dawn, the boy was gone, the garden was sealed, and Samuel Bennett was found guilty in every heart that mattered, even before the magistrate wrote a word. Alexander had believed it because grief needed a name to strike against, and Samuel's name had been offered first. Now the daughter of that disgraced man was living beneath his roof, scrubbing his floors, lowering her eyes to people who would never have survived a single winter on her wages. Clara Bennett had been kept at Blackthorn as an act of charity, his housekeeper once said. Charity. The word now tasted bitter. In truth, she had been allowed to remain only where she could be watched, pitied, and reminded that her blood carried a stain. Clara had no mother to plead for her, no brother to stand before her, no title to shield her from a careless accusation. She rose before 5 each morning, when the house was still black and cold, carrying coal scuttles along the back stairs while the upper chambers slept behind velvet curtains. She knew which floorboards groaned outside the Dowager Duchess's rooms, which parlor windows let in a draught, which silver tray Lady Vanessa preferred for breakfast when she wished to be admired. She knew how to become invisible. That was her first lesson at Blackthorn. Her second was harder. Never defend Samuel Bennet. Defense only made the family angrier. Defense only brought sharper whispers. So Clara swallowed her father's name for 12 years, keeping it alive only in the locked chamber of her own heart and in the tin box hidden beneath the loose floorboard beside her narrow bed. But that night, as Alexander returned through the terrace doors, the past followed him like a cold wind. In the great hall, Lady Vanessa Caldwell stood beneath the chandelier, dressed in ivory silk, her pale gloves folded neatly over the brooch she claimed had been damaged beyond repair. Her smile was gentle enough to fool a room and polished enough to wound without leaving a mark. "Your Grace," she said, turning toward him, "I hope the matter has not troubled you." Girls of that station often panic when confronted. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. He thought of Clara's knees on the frozen stone. He thought of the way she had said her father did not lie. Then he said, very quietly, "No one is to punish Miss Bennet." Vanessa's smile faltered. "But surely the household must have standards." "It will," Alexander replied, beginning with truth. Across the hall, several servants lowered their eyes. Somewhere below stairs, Clara Bennet had no idea that the first stone in the wall built against her father had just begun to crack. The order spread through Blackthorn Hall before the supper bells were rung. No one was to punish Clara Bennet. No wages would be docked. No dismissal would be prepared. No mention of the damaged brooch would be made until the Duke himself had reviewed the matter. In the servants' hall, the announcement settled over the long wooden table like a candle blown out by unseen breath. Clara stood near the pantry door with a basket of folded napkins in her arms, too still to appear surprised. She had expected Mrs. Hale to summon her, expected a week of extra duties, perhaps the loss of her small room beneath the eaves. Mercy was not a thing that usually found its way down the back stairs. Yet there it was, spoken in the butler's careful voice, carrying the weight of a command from above. "His Grace," said Miss Bennet, "is not to be touched by this matter." Touched. The word seemed strange to Clara. At Blackthorn, punishment rarely needed a hand. It lived in lowered eyes, in doors closed too quickly, in the pause before someone said her father's name. Across the room, 2 footmen exchanged glances. A kitchen maid whispered that perhaps the Duke had finally noticed Clara's face. Mrs. Hale silenced them with one look, but not before the whisper reached Clara's ears and burned there. She lowered her head, not from shame, but from the old instinct to survive attention. Attention had never brought her safety. In the upper wing, Alexander stood alone in his study while the rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The room smelled of leather, ash, and papers long undisturbed. On the desk before him lay the locked family record box, its brass corners dulled by age. He had sent for it the moment Lady Vanessa left the hall with her smile repaired, but her eyes sharpened. The key to the box had been in his possession for years. He had simply never wished to use it. Grief makes cowards of men who call themselves strong. Alexander understood that now as he lifted the lid and saw the old papers tied in black ribbon. Reports, household statements, a magistrate's summary, his mother's letters. Every page carried the same neat conclusion, that Samuel Bennet had failed in loyalty, failed in duty, failed the noble house that trusted him. Too neat, too clean. Alexander read until the fire sank low. There were missing times and signed notes, statements repeated with the stiffness of people taught what to say. The name Caldwell appeared twice in the margins, not accused, not explained, only present like a pale thread caught in dark cloth. He leaned back slowly, his jaw tightening. Lady Vanessa's family had been guests at Blackthorn the week the West Garden wing was lost. He remembered her father, Lord Caldwell, smiling beside his mother at breakfast the next morning, offering condolences with gloves so white they had seemed almost ceremonial. Alexander had been young enough then to mistake composure for innocence. Outside the study, The house quieted floor by floor. Candles were pinched out. Doors closed. Somewhere below, Clara climbed the narrow servants' staircase with the same silent steps she had used all her life. She paused at the small landing window overlooking the forbidden garden. The iron gate was barely visible through the rain, but she could feel its presence, feel the promise hidden behind it like a heartbeat under stone. From her apron pocket, she took the old iron key and wrapped her fingers around it until the cold bit into her palm. She did not know that, one floor above, the Duke had just found her father's name written beside a lie that no longer held together. She only knew that Blackthorn had shifted that night, quietly, dangerously, like a house beginning to remember what it had tried to forget. By morning, the rain had washed the gravel paths clean, but nothing in Blackthorn Hall felt cleansed. The servants moved with unusual care, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. Clara felt it in the breakfast room when Mrs. Hale told her to carry the silver coffee service upstairs, though that duty usually belonged to a senior maid. She felt it in the pause of the footmen, in the curious lift of brows, in the way Lady Vanessa Caldwell's maid looked at her, as though measuring where best to place a knife made of rumor. Clara kept her eyes lowered and her hands steady. The tray was heavy, its polished surface reflecting a pale version of her face, calm enough to fool anyone who did not know what fear looked like when it had been trained into obedience. In the morning parlor, Lady Vanessa sat beside the Dowager Duchess Margaret, sunlight touching the ivory lace at her wrists. She looked delicate, sorrowful, almost kind. That was her gift. She could make cruelty wear perfume. "Miss Bennet," Vanessa said softly, as Clara placed the coffee service on the low table, "I hope you understand that yesterday's unfortunate matter pains me deeply." Clara curtsied. "Yes, my lady. A household cannot survive suspicion," Vanessa continued, her gaze resting not on Clara's face, but on her hands. "Especially when certain people already carry difficult histories." The Dowager Duchess did not look up from her correspondence, yet the room chilled. Clara felt the old wordless accusation gather around her father's name. She said nothing. Silence had kept her fed. Silence had kept her employed. Silence had also kept Samuel Bennet buried beneath a lie. Vanessa reached for her cup, then stopped. Her expression changed with perfect timing. "How strange," she murmured. "My emerald clasp is missing." Clara's breath caught before she could stop it. The clasp had been on Vanessa's bodice when Clara entered. She had noticed it because green stones caught candlelight even in daylight, bright as garden glass. "Perhaps it has fallen," said the Dowager Duchess. Vanessa rose, touching her gown with graceful alarm. Her eyes moved to the coffee tray. There, beside the cream pitcher, lay a small emerald clasp. It had not been there a moment before. The room became very still. Clara looked at it, then at Vanessa, and understood with such clarity that fear left her for one clean second. This was not carelessness. This was arrangement. "Miss Bennet," Vanessa whispered, as though wounded by the discovery, "what have you done?" Clara's fingers tightened against her apron. "Nothing, my lady." The Dowager Duchess finally raised her eyes. They were gray like Alexander's, but without his unrest. "Call Mrs. Hale." Within minutes, the parlor filled with controlled scandal. Mrs. Hale arrived, then the butler, then two maids who pretended not to stare. Clara stood in the center of the room, white-faced but upright. Vanessa spoke gently of repeated incidents, of missing trinkets, of the danger of misplaced trust. Every sentence sounded merciful. Every sentence tightened the rope of opinion around Clara's throat without ever naming it. Then the door opened. Duke Alexander Whitmore entered without announcement. His dark coat was damp at the shoulders, as if he had come from the garden. His gaze moved once across the room, over Vanessa's pale hands, the clasp on the tray, Clara's lifted chin. "Did you take it?" he asked. Clara met his eyes. "No, Your Grace." A pause. Small. Immense. Then Alexander stepped beside her, not in front of her, not yet, but close enough for every person in the room to understand that she no longer stood entirely alone. "Then no one will punish her until I know who is lying." The room held its breath after Alexander spoke. Even the silver coffee pot seemed to catch the light more sharply, reflecting pale faces, tightened mouths, and Lady Vanessa Caldwell's smile as it struggled not to crack. Clara stood beside the Duke with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had been defended before only by memory, by the imagined voice of her father telling her to keep her back straight when the world wished to bend it. But memory had no title, no estate, no power to silence a room. Alexander did. "Your Grace," Vanessa said gently, recovering herself with practiced grace. "I fear your compassion does you credit, but perhaps not your judgment." The Dowager Duchess Margaret turned her head. "Alexander, this is a household matter." "Then it is mine," he replied. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Clara felt the words pass through the room like a door closing. Alexander picked up the emerald clasp from the tray, holding it between gloved fingers. "Mrs. Hale, when Miss Bennet entered this room, did you see this object on the coffee service?" The housekeeper hesitated, her loyalty divided between truth and survival. "No, Your Grace. I did not." Vanessa's eyes sharpened. "One hardly expects a housekeeper to notice every trinket. But one expects a lady to notice when a clasp leaves her own gown," Alexander said. The silence changed shape. Clara dared not look at him. Vanessa's cheeks colored faintly, not with shame, but with anger held under glass. "You cannot believe I would stage such a humiliating scene." Alexander placed the clasp on the table. "At present, I believe very little. That is the trouble." He turned to Clara. "Miss Bennet, you will come to my study at 3 o'clock." Mrs. Hale inhaled softly. The Dowager Duchess's eyes narrowed. Clara's heart struck once hard. "Yes, Your Grace." No more was said in the parlor, but the house spoke all day. By noon, every servant had heard that the Duke had questioned Lady Vanessa in front of the Dowager Duchess. By 1 o'clock, the rumor had grown teeth. By 2, Clara was told to change from her work apron into her plain black dress, the one reserved for church and funerals. She climbed to her attic room beneath the sloped roof, where winter drafts slid through the boards, and the ceiling was so low she could touch it with her fingertips. Beneath the loose plank beside her bed, she found the tin box. The old iron key lay inside, wrapped in her father's scrap of linen. She did not know why she took it with her. Perhaps because Alexander had spoken the word truth as though it were not a luxury reserved for the powerful. At 3 o'clock, Clara stood before the study door, listening to the low tick of the clock within. "Enter," Alexander said. The study was dim, the curtains half drawn against gray afternoon light. Papers covered his desk in careful disorder. Clara saw her father's name on one page and nearly forgot how to breathe. Alexander noticed. His expression changed, not softening exactly, but becoming less distant. "Your father told you something before he died," he said. Clara's hand closed around the key in her pocket. "He told me many things, Your Grace." "Did he tell you why he was accused?" Clara looked at the papers, then at the man whose family had carried that accusation like law for 12 years. "He told me Blackthorn would one day begin to die from a lie." Alexander was silent. Rain touched the window in fine silver lines. Slowly, Clara withdrew the old iron key and placed it on his desk. "He also told me this would open what your family locked away." Alexander stared at the key as if it were not made of metal, but of the past itself. Then he rose. "The garden gate." Clara nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." For the first time since she had known him, the Duke looked uncertain. Not weak, never that, but wounded by the possibility that he had mistaken guilt for grief. At last, he took the key. "Then we will see what Blackthorn has been hiding." The garden gate had not been opened in 12 years. Its ironwork was black with rain, its hinges swallowed by ivy, its crest half hidden beneath a crown of thorns and winter leaves. Clara stood a few steps behind Alexander as the gray afternoon lowered around Blackthorn Hall, turning every window into a watchful eye. He held her father's key in his gloved hand, yet for a long moment he did not place it in the lock. Clara understood. Some doors were not kept shut by metal. Some were held closed by grief, pride, and the terrible comfort of believing the first story one had been given. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "we do not have to do this today." Alexander looked toward the garden beyond the bars. Dead roses climbed the walls. The dry fountain waited at the center like a heart that had forgotten water. "Yes," he said, "we do." The key entered with a reluctant scrape. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the lock gave way with a dull, heavy click that seemed to pass through the ground beneath them. Alexander pushed the gate open. The hinges groaned, not loudly, but long enough for Clara to feel 12 years of silence loosen. They stepped inside together. The air smelled of wet stone, old leaves, and something faintly sweet beneath decay. Clara had entered once in despair, but daylight made the place stranger. The paths were almost gone under weeds. Marble benches leaned into the earth. At the far end, near a wall covered in ivy, stood a small angel statue with one wing chipped by age. Clara stopped. She knew it without knowing how. Her father had drawn that statue on the scrap of linen in her tin box. Beneath it, he had stitched 3 tiny marks in blue thread. "There," she whispered. Alexander followed her gaze. "What is it?" Clara knelt before the statue and pushed aside the wet leaves. Her fingers found a seam between 2 flat stones. The first would not move. The second shifted under pressure. Alexander stepped forward, but Clara shook her head. "Please." He meant me to find it. She worked carefully, lifting the stone inch by inch until a narrow hollow appeared beneath it. Inside rested a small metal case wrapped in oilcloth, still dry after all the years buried in darkness. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted it out. For a moment, she could only hold it against her chest. Not because it was heavy, but because the last thing her father had protected was finally breathing air again. Alexander crouched beside her, the distance between Duke and servant narrowed by mud, rain, and a truth neither of them yet understood. "Open it," he said softly. Clara unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside lay a strip of blue ribbon, a folded letter burned along one edge, and a silver cuff button bearing a crest she had seen only on polished carriages and sealed invitations. A falcon over 3 stars. Alexander took in the symbol, and the color left his face. "Caldwell," he said. Clara looked up. The wind moved through the dead roses behind them. Alexander reached for the burned letter but stopped before touching it, as if even paper could accuse him. Clara unfolded it with care. Most of the words were gone, eaten by smoke and time, but a few remained clear enough to read. The West Gate. Midnight. Payment after the marriage contract. No Whitmore heir must interfere. Alexander stood slowly. His expression had become very still, but not cold. It was the stillness of a man watching the ground open beneath everything he had called certainty. "Lady Vanessa's father," Clara said, her voice barely above the rain. Alexander closed his eyes once, then opened them toward the house, where warm windows glowed beyond the ruined garden. "Lord Caldwell was here that week." Clara held the ribbon in her palm. It was the exact shade Vanessa wore often, a soft blue chosen to make innocence look effortless. Alexander looked back at Clara then, and for the first time there was no accusation between them, no inherited judgment, no rank strong enough to bury what they had found. There was only the daughter of a ruined man, and the Duke who had spent 12 years grieving the wrong enemy. From somewhere near the house, a curtain fell closed in an upper window. Neither of them saw the pale gloved hand that released it. By dusk, Blackthorn Hall had become a house of closed doors and listening walls. Alexander locked the metal case in his study and sent for Mr. Whitaker, the family solicitor, with instructions written in a hand so controlled it looked carved rather than penned. Clara returned below stairs with mud on the hem of her dress, and a silence no one dared question directly. The servants knew the Duke had taken her into the forbidden garden. They knew Lady Vanessa had spent the afternoon in her chamber. They knew the Dowager Duchess had ordered her evening tea untouched. In great houses, truth did not arrive like thunder. It seeped under thresholds, chilled the carpets, and made every polished surface seem guilty. Clara washed her hands at the scullery sink until the garden soil faded from her skin, but nothing could wash away the sight of the Caldwell crest in that buried case. Her father had not died with shame. He had died with proof. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it frightened her. Proof was dangerous when it threatened people powerful enough to bury it. Near 7 o'clock, Mrs. Hale found her in the passage outside the linen room. "Lady Vanessa wishes to see you." Clara looked up slowly. "Me?" "In the blue sitting room." "At once." Mrs. Hale's expression was guarded, but something like warning passed through her eyes. Clara understood. Refusal was impossible. She crossed the back corridor, climbed the servants' stair, and entered the blue sitting room where Lady Vanessa stood by the mantel in a gown of pale blue silk, the very shade of the ribbon from the garden. The room smelled of roses, though no flowers stood in any vase. "Miss Bennet," Vanessa said, smiling softly, "you have had an unusual day." Clara curtsied. "Yes, my lady." His Grace is a generous man. Too generous, perhaps, when pity clouds his discernment. Clara kept her gaze lowered. I would not know, my lady. Vanessa stepped closer. Her gloves were spotless, white as milk, except near the hem where the faintest trace of reddish garden clay clung to one seam. Clara saw it and felt her heart still. The forbidden garden had only one patch of red soil beneath the angel statue. You should be careful, Vanessa continued. A girl in your position can mistake attention for rescue. It is a painful error. Clara lifted her eyes. I have asked for neither. For the first time, Vanessa's smile disappeared. No, girls like you never ask. You simply stand there with bruised eyes and tragic histories until foolish men imagine themselves noble. She turned toward the writing desk and picked up a folded handkerchief. His Grace will tire of this, and when he does, you will still be Samuel Bennett's daughter. Clara's face paled, but she did not answer. That refusal angered Vanessa more than tears would have. Leave, she said. Clara curtsied and reached the door with her composure intact, but the moment she entered the hall, a footman came running from the east wing. Mrs. Hale, come quickly. Within minutes, the house had gathered around Clara's attic room. Someone had searched beneath her bed. Someone had lifted the loose floorboard. Someone had placed a jeweled letter opener wrapped in a Caldwell handkerchief inside her tin box. It gleamed under the candlelight like a verdict prepared in advance. Clara stared at it without speaking. Mrs. Hale looked stricken. The Dowager Duchess arrived in black velvet, her cane striking once against the floor. Vanessa stood behind her, pale and wounded again, one hand at her throat. This has gone far enough, the Dowager Duchess said. Clara felt the room tilt around her, not from guilt, but from exhaustion. How many times could a lie be dressed as evidence before the world agreed to call it truth? Then Alexander appeared at the top of the stairs. His gaze moved over the open tin box, the planted object, Vanessa's perfect sorrow, and finally her gloves. A small trace of red clay marked the right seam. His eyes hardened. How fortunate, he said quietly, that lies always bring a little dirt with them. Alexander's words struck the attic room with more force than any shout could have done. No one moved. The candle flames bent in the draft from the stairwell, throwing long shadows across the sloped ceiling, across Clara's narrow bed, across the tin box that held the last poor relics of her father's life. Vanessa's gloved hand tightened at her throat, but Alexander was no longer looking at her face. He was looking at the seam of her glove, where a thin line of red clay clung like a confession too small for anyone careless to notice. Your Grace, Vanessa said, her voice fragile with practiced injury. Surely you are not suggesting that I entered a servant's room. I am suggesting nothing, Alexander replied. I am observing. The Dowager Duchess Margaret turned sharply toward him. This is beneath you. For the first time, pain crossed Alexander's face, quiet and terrible. No, mother. What was beneath us was letting a dead man carry our shame for 12 years. The words emptied the room. Clara's breath caught. Mrs. Hale covered her mouth with one hand. The Dowager Duchess went pale, not with ignorance, but with the sudden fear of a locked door opening at last. Alexander stepped into the room and picked up the jeweled letter opener without touching the blade, holding it by the folded cloth around it. This was placed here tonight. Miss Bennet was in the blue sitting room when it happened. Lady Vanessa sent for her there. Vanessa's eyes flicked once toward Mrs. Hale, too quickly. Alexander saw it. Mrs. Hale, he said, who carried that message? The housekeeper swallowed. I did, Your Grace. Lady Vanessa instructed me herself. And during that time, who had reason to know Miss Bennet's room would be empty? Silence answered before anyone else could. Vanessa's softness hardened. This is absurd. You are allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment over a maid. Clara flinched, not from the word, but from the old certainty beneath it. A maid. As if that were all a soul could be. Alexander set the letter opener on the table and moved to stand behind Clara. Not beside her this time. Behind her. The same place he had stood in the garden when she believed herself alone, but now every eye in the house could see him there. The girl you call a liar has been guarding the truth my family buried, he said. His voice was low, but it carried down the staircase, where more servants had gathered in the shadows. Samuel Bennet did not betray Blackthorn. He left proof. Proof bearing the Caldwell crest. Proof of a midnight arrangement, a payment promised after a marriage contract, and a plan to remove any obstacle to Caldwell influence over this house. Vanessa's face changed. Only for a second, but enough. The mask slipped, and beneath the lace and pearl-colored silk stood not a wounded lady, but a cornered one. You cannot prove such a thing. My solicitor is already on the road, Alexander said, and the metal case is locked in my study. The Dowager Duchess gripped her cane. Alexander, think carefully. A broken engagement will stain this family. He looked at his mother then, and whatever boy had once obeyed grief in that house disappeared from his eyes. So did a false accusation. Clara felt the words settle around her like a cloak placed over shaking shoulders. Not pity, not favor, justice. Vanessa stepped back, her skirts whispering over the floorboards. You would choose her name over mine? Alexander did not look away. No, I am choosing the truth over yours. The attic seemed to grow larger, as if Clara's small room had become the center of Blackthorn Hall, and every grand chamber below had shrunk in shame. For 12 years, her father's name had been spoken like a stain. For 12 years, Clara had stood alone beneath it. Now the Duke of Blackthorn stood behind her, and the house that had condemned her finally began to bow its head. By dawn, the solicitor's carriage rolled through the gates of Blackthorn Hall beneath a sky washed clean by rain. Mr. Whitaker arrived with 2 clerks, 3 sealed ledgers, and the grave expression of a man who had spent the night reading the sins of old families by lamplight. The metal case from the garden was opened in Alexander's study while the Dowager Duchess sat rigid near the fire, and Lady Vanessa Caldwell stood by the window, pale now in a way no powder could imitate. Clara was asked to remain. Not ordered. Asked. That single courtesy nearly undid her more than any accusation had. She stood beside the bookshelf in her plain black dress, hands folded, her father's linen scrap tucked safely in her pocket. Mr. Whitaker examined the burned letter, the Caldwell crest, the blue ribbon, and the old household timesheets Alexander had found. Piece by piece, the story changed shape. Samuel Bennet had not opened the west gate to betray Blackthorn. He had discovered another gate already unlocked and had tried to warn the family before the midnight meeting could finish its purpose. He had hidden what proof he could when he realized no one in power wished to hear him. The payment mentioned in the letter had been tied to a marriage arrangement between the Caldwell family and Blackthorn, an arrangement that would have grown stronger if grief had left Alexander obedient, isolated, and easy to guide. Vanessa said nothing when her father's handwriting was confirmed. Silence, at last, had chosen another victim. By noon, the engagement was ended. No scene was allowed to become vulgar, no shouting permitted to stain the halls further. Alexander simply stood in the great hall before the household and announced that Lady Vanessa Caldwell would depart Blackthorn before evening and that the name of Samuel Bennet was to be restored in every family record where it had been wrongfully marked. The words traveled through the servants like warmth returning to a frozen room. Clara did not cry. Not there. Her father deserved more than spectacle. She held herself still while Mrs. Hale lowered her head, while footmen who had once whispered looked at the floor, while the Dowager Duchess remained seated with one hand pressed to her cane and regret carved deeply into her face. Later, when the house had emptied of Caldwell trunks and Caldwell perfume, Alexander found Clara in the garden. The gate stood open now. Morning light touched the dead roses, the broken fountain, the angel with the chipped wing. Clara knelt beside the soil beneath the statue, pressing a small white rose cutting into the earth. Alexander stopped a few feet away. Your father saved more than this house, he said. Clara brushed soil from her fingers. He only wanted the truth to live long enough to be found. Alexander looked at the garden that grief had turned into a tomb and shame had kept locked. Then let it live here. Clara rose slowly. Your Grace. Not as a servant hiding among dead flowers, he said. As the keeper of this garden. With wages worthy of the work, rooms worthy of your name, and the protection this house failed to give you. Clara studied him, searching for pity and finding none. Only remorse. Only respect. Something fragile moved between them, not romance spoken too soon, but recognition. 2 wounded souls standing in a place once ruined by silence. Thank you, she whispered. Alexander bowed his head, not as a duke granting favor, but as a man receiving forgiveness he had not yet earned. Weeks later, the first white roses bloomed along the fountain. Water returned to the stone basin in a clear silver stream. Visitors said Blackthorn Hall seemed changed, as if the old house had begun to breathe again. But Clara knew the truth. Houses do not heal because time passes. They heal when someone brave enough opens the locked gate, and someone honest enough finally listens. Some tears do not ask to be seen, but when the right heart witnesses them, silence itself becomes justice.